are you? And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and I'm here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time to talk about military history, doctrine, leadership practices, all to distill from them lessons that we can apply to our businesses and professional practices. So today, our topic is winning without fighting every battle. And I think for those of us who come out of a military background, this is a somewhat challenging lesson to absorb, even though today's show is based on one of, if not the best known example of why this is so important and why in a military context it saves lives. So I know for myself, I tend to want to fight every battle, either because, well, often because the battles I'm fighting are not really for my own benefit, they're for my client's benefit. And having a fiduciary responsibility to those clients, generally the estate of a deceased person, and so the beneficiaries of that estate, I feel like I can't really quit when what I'm working on, it's not benefiting me, it's benefiting these other people. Nonetheless, there have been in the last year and a half times when the economic cost of continuing to fight was greater than what I could ever have hoped to gain by continuing the fight. And so it required me to recognize that sometimes winning the war means not fighting every battle. And the historic example I'm using to illustrate this concept is the history of General Douglas MacArthur's island hopping strategy during World War II. So to set the scene a little bit, after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on 7 December 1941, the U.S. was faced with what, by any measure, was the enormous challenge of defeating the Imperial Japan across the entire, well, not literally the entire Pacific Ocean, but across much of the Pacific Ocean, and the fact that Japan had numerous hundreds of islands that they had occupied in their sweep east from the Japanese islands themselves. They controlled many of these islands, and originally the U.S. strategy was to reclaim every single one of those islands. Now, the problem with that was that it was very costly to take an island in the Pacific when it was being defended by a military force. So for the Japanese who conquered these islands, generally speaking, they were faced with the natives living there, and the Japanese easily overwhelmed them. And then they fortified these islands in a way that made, in essence, taking them away from the Japanese very costly in terms of lives. So while the United States did a tremendous amount of training in amphibious warfare, nonetheless, when you're sending Marines and soldiers to storm a beach, and they are faced with well-entrenched and placed machine gun fire, mortar fire, all kinds of booby traps. So, hundreds, in some cases, thousands of lives were lost, not to mention the number of men wounded. in attacking each one of these islands. And it became clear fairly early on that this was not a viable strategy. So what Douglas MacArthur decided, and he was the so to set the scene a little further. While General MacArthur wanted to control the entire Pacific theater during World War II, Roosevelt did not go along with that. Now, I think there were several reasons. One was that uh, MacArthur was known for being extraordinarily egotistical, and he didn't get along with Roosevelt. MacArthur himself was a Republican, and of course, FDR was a Democrat. And unlike a lot of the um, military leaders at the beginning of World War II, who had no interest in getting involved in politics, it seemed pretty clear that MacArthur had political aspirations. And so FDR was loath to create a situation where he, in essence, built up a political rival who could potentially defeat him in a presidential election. And so rather than giving General MacArthur the entire command over the entire Pacific Ocean, or the entire Pacific theater of operations, in the way that he did with Dwight Eisenhower, who, by the way, was also a Republican, but was very quiet about his politics, number one. And number two, evinced no interest in running for president while he was in the Army. Dwight Eisenhower was given sole command of the European theater of operations. So it wasn't that FDR was philosophically opposed to one leader having command of an entire theater of operations. His objection was to MacArthur himself. And one could, I think, make the case that MacArthur, in many ways, was his own worst enemy when it came to attempting to gain that command position. And so instead of giving General MacArthur sole command of the Pacific Theater operations, FDR split it between General MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz. Now, that's not to say that it was only an anti-MacArthur move. The Navy, led by Admiral Ernest King, felt very strongly that the Navy should have sole command of the Pacific Theater of Operations, because the Pacific Ocean is an ocean, right? It's a water-based. It was a water-based area of command, and so Admiral King put a tremendous amount of pressure on FDR to give, not for himself, but to give an admiral sole command of the Pacific Theater, and Chester Nimitz was sort of the admiral who was probably the best fit for such a command. But FDR was reluctant to so obviously slap the Army in the face. And so he ended up creating a divided command. So Douglas MacArthur was given command of the forces in the Southwest Pacific, which is basically kind of the Southern Pacific, Australia, New Guinea, etc. And Chester Nimitz was given command of the Central Pacific, basically starting from Midway and moving through the Central Pacific, heading toward the Japanese islands. And this divided command, many people argued, was clearly not optimal. It was based as much on political considerations as it was military considerations. But there you have it. And so both commanders, faced with the reality of the huge losses they would suffer in personnel, taking every single island, they came up with the idea of only taking the islands that it was strategically necessary to take. And the idea was that by hopping over actually most of the islands and only taking those that would advance the strategic objective of defeating, of basically getting to the point where they could invade the Japanese home islands, they would cut off the Imperial Japanese Navy's ability to resupply the islands that were skipped over. Excuse me. And in so doing, those islands would wither on the vine, was the term that they used. And in the event, that is what happened. And so uh, what what they did was they looked at what were the strategically important locations. So, for example, Papua New Guinea was a strategically important location. There was a huge debate over whether the Philippines were strategically important in this plan, as opposed to skipping over the Philippines and going straight to Taiwan. And there were there in many people thought there was a much better case for skipping the Philippines. General MacArthur would not hear it, having been essentially kicked out of the Philippines at the beginning of the war and pledging that I will return, the famous line that MacArthur made. He felt it would have been a betrayal to the people of the Philippines to skip over the Philippines. And so there was, I think, it's certainly from MacArthur's standpoint, no question that the Philippines would be was a strategically important location, with the added benefit that it allowed him to redeem his pledge to the Philippine people. And so, the decisions were made about which islands were strategically important. Okay, those that were included Tinian, Guam, the Marshalls, the Gilberts, and so you have famous battles like Guam, the battle for Iwo Jima was one of the most famous battles, where the iconic image of raising the American flag on Mount Suribachi, and then finally Okinawa, which was kind of the last step before what would have been an invasion of the Japanese home islands, and hundreds of islands were skipped over. It's why, if you've ever watched TV programs like, for example, Gilligan's Island, where obviously it's fictional. The seven um, people who were on the SS Minnow, they ended up getting stranded on a desert island in the middle of the Pacific, and one day they find this Japanese soldier sort of hiding out in the jungle. So for years after World War II, there were Japanese soldiers on these islands that were skipped over who didn't know that the war was over, and from their perspective, their intention was to keep fighting. So that's where that sort of image came from, and indeed it was true. There were soldiers left behind who didn't know the war was over. So on the islands that were actually invaded, so they were first of all chosen on the basis of airfield potential, so that aircraft could be staged on that island in preparation for the invasion of the next strategically important island. They also looked at how easily could the island be resupplied. Did it have any kind of natural harbor that made resupply easier? What was the tactical and operational factors that would make the island more or less difficult to conquer? And finally, how did it overall support future operations? So, if you recall, the dropping of the atomic bombs by the Enola Gay, or of the atomic bomb, I should say, it didn't drop more; it dropped one. The dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima by the Enola Gay, that that plane left from an airfield on a small island known as Tinian, and Tinian was one of the reasons why Tinian was retaken was because it did present the opportunity to build an airfield where the larger bombers that were flown toward the end of World War II could be staged for bombing raids on the Japanese mainland. And the idea was to capture Tinian and basically do these continual, not literally continual, but these almost daily bombing raids of the Japanese main islands in order to break the will of the Japanese people and create pressure for Japan, Imperial Japan, to surrender. In the event, despite the fire bombings and the destruction of Japanese cities, the killing of thousands, tens of thousands of civilians by conventional bombing, there doesn't appear to be much evidence, if any, that this bombing campaign had an impact on the final decision by the Japanese emperor to surrender. In fact, it really was the dropping of the atomic bombs and the threat of further atomic bomb bombings that convinced the emperor that further resistance was fruitless. His people would only be needlessly destroyed. But the capture of Tinian, as an example, is one that shows the strategic thinking of the United States, that although the strategy of conventional bombing of the home islands, the Japanese home islands, it in the end probably was ineffectual, but the reason for taking Tinian was to pursue that particular strategic objective. So I mentioned a number of the key campaigns: the Philippines, New Guinea, Okinawa. So especially on these larger locations like New Guinea, like the Philippines, so sort of large rear bases were built in these locations, moving the main ability to supply and fight the war ever closer to the Japanese main islands. And so it wasn't just a matter of taking smaller islands like Tinian that allowed the island hopping to continue, but to have to go back to, say, the Hawaiian Islands, for example, for resupply just didn't make sense. And so larger islands had to be taken where supply depots and training bases and such, rest facilities, could be created, and so that the pace of military operations could be maintained. So there were selections made of strategic islands to take, both large and small, depending on the particular strategic need of, or it really as part of the overall strategy, but depending on the particular tactical and operational needs for actually pursuing that strategy. less critical islands were bypassed, and the Japanese forces were stranded there. They, pretty quickly ran out of supplies. Uh, the Japanese did attempt, in some cases, to resupply them using submarines. In general, that effort was not successful. Of course, the submarines got through at times, but as a resupply strategy, it really was not effective. And so this idea of island hopping and not fighting every battle, but winning the war, in the end, it worked out, and it worked out quite effectively. So in the end, it allowed the United States to advance much more rapidly in defeating Imperial Japan. It saved, in terms of American lives, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of American lives potentially. And most importantly, it uh, it 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 showed that uh, the idea of the sort of so the style of warfare, or not, style is kind of a poor word, but the mode of warfare being used in Europe, the sort of blitzkrieg, to use the German name for it, the rapid advancing, warfare that General Patton used, where you just rolled over an area, recapturing a big swath of land, and there was nothing left unliberated in between. That was not the right mode of warfare for the Pacific theater. And this is, while this is not the focus of today's show, I think it is an important lesson for us to keep in mind, that the strategy we use in a particular situation that works shouldn't be assumed to be the best strategy in a different situation. Business, just like military strategies, need to be tailored for the circumstances faced in a particular battle or war. So too in business, the strategy that we pursue in a business needs to fit the particular circumstances. There is no one size fits all. And this is something that I see quite often when I look at different recommendations on how to use social media, for whether it's social media advertising, whether it's podcasts like I do, these kinds of things. So what is a successful strategy for me is not necessarily going to be a successful strategy for you and your business. Presumably, we don't have the same clientele, we don't have the same business goals, we don't face the same obstacles, we have different sets of knowledge, skills, and experience. And so all of these mean that we need to tailor our strategy for our particular business. And MacArthur's island hopping strategy was the correct strategy for the Pacific theater of operations. Such a strategy would not have worked in Europe. It just would not have. It was a land-based war, not a water-based war. And it just wouldn't have worked. To leave active units of the enemy's military behind while your force moved on would only mean that you were going to be you were going to end up fighting at least a two-front campaign. One, the one in front of you, and two, the one with the units of the military, the enemy military that you left behind. Even with conquering every town and city along the way, there was still guerrilla activity that would arise in some cases, because it could. Whereas in the Pacific theater, once an island was bypassed, it was essentially not possible for that island to mount some kind of attack on the American forces as they moved forward. Okay, so that is the context of General MacArthur's island hopping strategy, and of course, as I said a moment ago, it worked. Uh, the Imperial Japan surrendered. Let's see, it would be 70 years ago, I believe, this month. Um, yeah, 70 years ago. Yeah, because I believe it was, I want to say September 6th, maybe, that Imperial Japan surrendered in a and then subsequently there was a ceremony on board the USS Missouri, the battleship USS Missouri, in which of the final surrender was signed. So then, what are the more specific lessons, right, that we can learn from this idea of not fighting every battle on our way to winning? I don't want to call business the war, but in the way, on the way to a winning business strategy, or our businesses expanding and growing. What are the individual lessons that we can take from the idea of island hopping in the Pacific theater of operations? So the first one I came up with is that we need to focus on strategic targets, not every single opportunity. So, as I just related, MacArthur ignored the islands that didn't contribute to the broader goal. Okay. And from a business standpoint, okay, companies shouldn't pursue every lead or market. What they should focus on is high impact opportunities. So I know in my own business, um, I get inquiries. It seems like every day. It's probably not that frequent, but during the week, for, oh, we want you to do this, we want you to do that. I get them through LinkedIn, I get them through email, and they're just distractions. It makes no sense at all for me to pursue those opportunities. And and as much as I know this, sometimes I still sort of, fall prey to. This happened a few weeks ago. I got a LinkedIn message from someone that I thought I knew, which is why I responded. And he said, would you like, essentially to, increase your income, right? And so I pinged him back and I said, well, what do you have on your mind? He said, well, I've got a number of positions that I think, based on your profile, you would be right for. And my response was, I'm not looking to be an employee. So if you have clients who would be interested in hiring me or hiring my company, right, then it might be, for the things that I'm already doing, then that might be something for me to consider. It took two or three more rounds to get him to absorb the idea that I was not going to take a job. I have my company. I'm not looking to become an employee. A complete waste of my time. A complete waste of my time. And now, it just reinforces when I get these inquiries. I just, are you in? No, I'm not interested. Not going to have the conversation. Not going to get involved in you convincing me that I'm better off, I don't know, closing my business and that sort of thing. It just makes no sense for me to even engage in those conversations, even if they're, just through emailing or, messaging. So, to look at a perhaps a better known situation, right? When you think about a company like Amazon, today it seems to be into everything. But I think it's important to remember that when Amazon started, it was focused only on selling books. Okay, and Jeff Bezos worked hard to create a successful online bookseller. And he kept that focus very narrow. He didn't get distracted by other opportunities. Okay, so he kept a focused goal until really he became, and still is, the dominant bookseller, not just in the United States, literally in the world. Okay, and it wasn't until he had achieved that strategic objective that then he looked farther afield and started getting into other areas of e-commerce. Okay, now Amazon is the dominant e-commerce company in the world. Maybe Alibaba out of China is number two, or maybe Temu, but Amazon is dominant. Now, here's the interesting thing: knowing online commerce as well as they did, for some reason, Amazon for a while thought that they should get into conventional stores, so-called bricks and mortar stores. And the endeavor was not successful. I saw when one of the stores was in a mall not too far from where I live, a really wonderful mall in Century City. It's open air. It's a well, sometimes it's a pleasure to walk around there. Sometimes the music is just too bloody loud. And I visited the Amazon store a couple of times. It was not a good place to shop. There was nothing interesting there to buy. I mean, the books that they were featuring were just not anything that I was in which I was interested. And as far as I could tell, to have space in this mall in Century City was an expensive proposition. I don't know what the rents are, but I suspect they were somewhere in the neighborhood of $8 to $10 per square foot per month. Okay, so my guess is, Amazon could easily have been paying somewhere in the neighborhood of $50,000 to $100,000 per month for that store, right? And all it was really a place for people to return. It was like an Amazon return outlet. That's what I used it for, right? So when Amazon pursued an opportunity that didn't make sense for its company, it lost out, right? Now, of course, nobody died, right? Like would have happened in the Pacific Theater of Operations during World War II if an island that didn't need to be taken was taken. Nonetheless, there was, a loss of money, a loss of strategic focus that I think was, detrimental in at least some way for Amazon, right? It was not a success. Okay, in distinction to other things in which Amazon has gotten involved, that was not. Now it'll be interesting. Amazon acquired, it was either One Medical or I think it was One Medical, which is a concierge healthcare company. I haven't heard really how well One Medical is doing under Amazon's control. Amazon is getting more and more into healthcare, selling prescription medications, etc. So it'll be interesting to see. Healthcare is, it has an online aspect to it, but it's not an online business like the other areas in which Amazon has historically been successful. So again, focus on strategic targets. Don't get distracted by chasing after every opportunity. That's lesson number one. Okay, let's take a break. America is a maritime nation. Our freedom and security depend on strong sea services. The Beverly Hills Council of the Navy League stands with our Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and Merchant Marine through community support, education, and advocacy. For over 120 years, Americans of all walks of life have heeded our call. No prior military service is required to join our mission. The Beverly Hills Council of the Navy League of the United States. Help us support those who serve at sea. Visit NavyLeague.org. So this is Business Lessons from the Military, and I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel. We're talking about the strategy pursued by Douglas MacArthur and really by Admiral Chester Nimitz as well in the Pacific theater of World War II, where instead of taking every single island, they actually only retook the islands that were strategically significant in defeating Imperial Japan. And so looking at the business lessons we can draw from that. So the first one is to focus on strategic targets, not every opportunity. Next, conserve resources by avoiding costly battles. So the direct assaults, the direct amphibious assaults on heavily fortified islands were avoided to save lives and materiel. So while, of course, the lives were much more important than the loss of materiel, nonetheless, it wasn't as if the United States had endless numbers of small arms, machine guns, rifles, grenades. It wasn't as if the U.S. had an unlimited number of tanks, or for that matter, even landing craft. So one of the big dilemmas in World War II, which came into focus during the planning of Operation Overlord, which was the invasion of Europe by the Allies, in particular the United States, Great Britain, and Canada, was having enough landing craft, and so while it would seem like the Pacific theater should have had the priority for landing craft because they had to have them in order to make an amphibious assault on an island, the reality is they were just as crucial for Overlord. And because there was not an unlimited number, they had to be in some ways allocated between the two theaters of the war. And so and a lot of these landing craft would be damaged or destroyed in the taking of any particular island. And so the conserving of materiel was important so that the war could continue to be prosecuted. So in business too, right? And if we can avoid a head-to-head conflict in areas where the costs of entry are very high, we can hopefully find alternative routes to success. So one of the aspects I've mentioned, from time to time, my friend Bill Gross, who's one of the top probate real estate agents here, probate real estate agents in the country. So Bill and I talk about what is the most effective way that we can grow the audiences for our respective shows. And we've looked at different aspects. So if you go online and you look at the YouTube videos on how to grow a YouTube channel, they focus on things like, optimizing your thumbnails, your video should be X time long or Y time long, all these kinds of things. So what we've found is that the bottom line is, for what we can spend on YouTube ads to grow our audience and extend our reach is far less than what we would spend infinitely trying to optimize thumbnails and trying to predict just what is the right length of a particular show that we're doing. So we've concluded that if we're producing good content, which is content that informs people, that's useful for them in their professional lives, or in my case, because I have my shows also help out people who are involved in their own estate planning and administration, so individual lives. Uh, that's really what's most important. So, number one, create good content. Number two, promote it. Let Google promote it, or well, YouTube. YouTube, of course, is part of Google, part of Alphabet anyway. And the fact of the matter is, YouTube can target and promote content far better than Bill or I can, far better than anybody can, right? They spend, a huge amount of time figuring out how to serve up content that people want to watch. And so, for us to use resources in these other areas, uh, you know, presumably, I don't know, fighting it out with other content providers doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make any sense. And I think another. I'll give you another example. Uh, um, I had to make a choice about 3-4 months ago. Um, I had I have an estate, and one of the properties had a loan on it, and the lender chose to call the loan when the owner died. They didn't have to, but they decided to do so. And I tried for quite some time to refinance the loan, couldn't find anyone to do so. The lender got antsy and they started to threaten foreclosure. And the fact of the matter is, the lender had acted in bad faith. I found out later that this was their pattern because a colleague of mine had a very similar incident happen with the same lender. So the question was, do I spend resources fighting the lender and attempting to prove that they had acted in bad faith? And so then essentially forcing them to wait out the administration of the probate and until I could find another lender to refinance them out, or just go ahead and pay them off since the estate had the resources to do so. And in the end, it wasn't worth the resources I would have had to have spent fighting the lender, even if I had won, because it was unlikely that I would have gotten reimbursement of most, let alone all, of the legal fees I would have had to have paid. And in the end, I was still going to have to pay off the loan. The maturity date of the loan was about a year from when this whole issue came to a head. So the best thing that I could hope for was to, essentially delay having to pay the loan for another 12 months. And in the event, at the point where I paid it off, it was another, I think, 8 or 9 months, until the loan matured. And at that point, whether they had acted in bad faith or not, the lender was entitled to be paid off. They wouldn't have been allowed to foreclose because the property was in probate, but it would have become a very difficult legal situation. And so it wasn't worth it for me to continue to fight that battle and to devote more resources to it. At that point, just pay them off, send them on their way. And indeed, unfortunately, this is how some organizations, I want to say people, because the lender was not a person, it was a bank. This is just how some banks look at it. They don't care whether what they're doing is right or moral. All they care about is, do we think this is going to be to our financial advantage? And if they deem that it is, then that's it. That's the end of it from their standpoint, right? And so sometimes we have to do a cost benefit analysis And oftentimes the better decision is to conserve resources by avoiding costly battles. And that was certainly part of a large part of why MacArthur and Nimitz adopted the island hopping strategy. It was to avoid those costly battles. Okay, next, cut off competitors' supply lines. So, as I mentioned in talking about how the island hopping strategy worked, the idea was that by hopping over a lot of the islands that were still garrisoned by Imperial Japanese troops, they would be cut off. They couldn't be resupplied. And so they didn't pose any kind of danger of, American forces being attacked essentially from the rear, right? So the islands were isolated and they withered on the vine. So they were neutralized without having to retake the islands or face, a costly amphibious operation. And so one of the strategies that we can use is to disrupt a competitor's access to resources, to distribution channels, or to customers in a way that weakens them indirectly, right? And so one of the things that I've seen is that when another business is pursuing a strategy that doesn't look to me to be one that's going to financially pay off, the best thing I can do is just let them go on and, in essence, wound themselves, put themselves behind a financial eight ball, so to speak. So, not in this iteration of my career, but when I had my real estate company prior to my joining the Navy in the late mid 1980s through mid 2000s. So there was a large company that was one of my competitors, and they were very, very aggressive. And typically among management companies, it's considered, I mean, when I entered the property management business, it was bad form to literally try to steal your competitors' clients. So if somebody had a management contract with a client, okay, so you didn't contact them. Or if you contacted them and said, "Oh, I already have a management company," it was okay, that's fine. Um, you know, if you for some reason ever decide want to consider a different company, if you'd like to take my number, great. And if not, thank you so much for your time. That was kind of it. This particular company, they would just say the most horrendous lies in order to convince the client of one of their competitors to leave their competitor and come into their company. And it worked in the beginning until their customers, their clients, figured out that, number one, what they were saying about their competitors was really what they were doing, i.e., that they were not acting in any kind of ethical way, number one. And number two, they couldn't deliver on what they promised their clients they would do, right? And so they were essentially cutting their own throat. Today, this huge company barely exists anymore. At one time, they were the dominant property management and leasing company of retail properties here in the greater Los Angeles area. Today, they are virtually nothing. And other companies that operated on an ethical basis have continued to operate. They've seen no appreciable shrinkage in business, probably have grown. Okay. And this other company has essentially imploded. So that's that in a way, you know, by not taking them on head on, but letting them follow their own sort of um, disreputable policies. Okay, they self-destroyed their distribution channels. They self-destroyed their customers, weakening themselves and eventually collapsing, right? And so this is sort of using jujitsu on them, if you will, by in essence letting them cut off their own supply lines of new clients. Okay, so I know a little bit of a convoluted example, but um, the philosophy is never get in the way of your competitor when they're cutting their own throat. That's basically what it comes down to. So whether you're taking active steps to cut them off from customers, clients, supplies, distribution channels, or whether they're doing it to themselves and you just stand back and let them do it, the strategy is to cut off your competitors from their supply lines. Okay. All right. Next, build. Well, actually, we're going to run short on time here. Let me just see which ones I want to. Okay. I'm going to skip a couple of them. The last one is keep the end goal in sight. Okay. This is the most important aspect of the island hopping strategy is uh, Nimitz and MacArthur kept the end goal, which was the defeat and surrender of Imperial Japan. That was the goal. The goal was not to capture a whole bunch of islands. The goal was to get Japan to surrender. Now, people have argued that MacArthur taking the Philippines was a distraction from that. I'm as much as I'm not a if you watch this show, you know I'm a big fan of General Patton. Not a big fan, frankly, of Douglas MacArthur. Later in his career, to digress for a moment, he was actually fired by Harry S. Truman when Truman was president. Well deserved firing, by the way. MacArthur, like I said, was just had an enormous egotist. He in some ways he made Patton look humble. So, um, but I think that his insistence on retaking the Philippines was the correct thing to do. It was too large a target to leave behind. Number one. Number two, the Philippines, unlike a lot of the other islands, the Philippines was essentially an American protectorate, and so the United States had a different relationship with the Philippines that they did with other islands that we skipped, and the Americans and Philippines were fighting together guerrilla operations against the Japanese. And had the Philippines been hopped over, and Japan had realized it could no longer resupply its Philippines garrison, there's a good chance that the Japanese, as brutal as they were in the Philippines, could have been even more so. And so to leave the Philippines behind, I think didn't make sense. And so I don't think that retaking the Philippines represented losing sight of the end goal on MacArthur's part. I think while redeeming his own pledge to return was certainly part of his motivation, there were strong strategic reasons and strong moral reasons for the United States to recapture the Philippines, and prevent even more harsh depredations on the Philippine people on the part of Imperial Japan. So, as we look at our businesses, hopefully we have an end goal that developed for our business. I mean, if our end goal for our business is just to keep growing it ad infinitum, I think that is not a goal. Okay, it's not specific enough. So, to go back to the example of Amazon for a moment, their initial end goal was to become the number one bookseller presumably in the country. They end up, as I mentioned, of course, becoming the number one bookseller in the world. So they stayed focused on that end goal and did not get distracted from it. Okay, and in doing so, um, they they were able to focus all their energy on obtaining that end goal. So another example of that is Tesla. Now, while one could, I think, fairly credibly make an argument that not so much Tesla, but Elon Musk at this point in his career has lost focus because he has so many things going on between Tesla, SpaceX, Starlink, X, right? He has all these companies in which he's involved, and not to mention forays outside of the business world, that he's lost focus. But when he started Tesla, his end goal was to create an actual viable electric vehicle, and a profitable, successful company to supply those vehicles. And he was very focused on that goal. There are, the legendary stories of when he was having trouble meeting production targets and such. He slept on the floor of his office for week after week and all those kind of things, right? So that is all demonstrative of Elon Musk's goal to keep the end goal in sight, right? And he did build a very successful car manufacturing company. Now he's facing more competition, in particular from China. And there's been backlash from some of his political activities by people who either have already bought Teslas or who would have but then didn't because they didn't like us. All that kind of, okay, fine. That's that. But in its original version, Elon Musk was very focused on making Tesla the premier electric car company. And the reality is, it still has that place. Okay. China is trying to overtake it, but it hasn't yet. Now, it may soon. We'll have to see. There appears to be, Elon Musk appears to be refocusing his attention on Tesla. Unfortunately, I think there's still all these other things, all these other companies in which he's involved. So it will be interesting to watch, how effectively he is able to get back to keeping the end goal for Tesla in sight. Okay, so those are, I think, some of the lessons that we can learn from MacArthur's island hopping strategy in the Pacific Theater of Operations during World War II. Be interested to hear your questions, comments, criticisms. Social media links will be in the show notes after this episode posts. Actually, it's already in the show notes on YouTube. I figured out how to update them before a show airs. And so love to hear them. Thank you very much for joining me today, especially my live viewers. And let's see, tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific time is my show, People Making Money. On Thursday at 5 p.m. Pacific time is my show, Jiggers' Place. We'll sit back and have a cocktail and a schmooze. And then next week on Monday at 10 a.m. Pacific time is my show, Trusts and Estates Weekly. And I'll be back a week from today with the next edition of Business Lessons from the Military. So thanks again for watching, and signing off as I always do. Marie, darling, you are my belle. Courage at all times, my friends.